Good evening, winners. It's time now for The Clash. Well, as we discussed before the break, Matt Hancock is in hot water over the Telegraph's lockdown files and his alleged negligence towards care homes. According to the leaked WhatsApp messages, a month into the pandemic, Chief Medical Officer Chris Whitty urged the then Health Secretary to test all residents going into English care homes for COVID. But Hancock dismissed the guidance because it would, quote, muddy the waters. What does that even mean? Seriously. Then, on the eve of the second lockdown in October 2020, he retained rules preventing husbands seeing wives in care homes, despite being warned by Social Care Secretary Helen Whatley they were inhumane. Now, a spokesman for Hancock has disputed the claims, saying, these stolen messages have been doctored to create a false story that Matt rejected clinical advice on care home testing. This is flat wrong. But with many furious about these revelations, and the fact that this story is, I think we can all agree, likely to rumble on, tonight I am asking, should Matt Hancock face a criminal investigation for his pandemic failings? Let me know your thoughts by emailing dan@gbnews.uk or tweet me @gbnews. And while you're there, go and vote in our poll. I will bring you the results very, very shortly. But to debate this now, I am joined by director and founder of Care Campaign for the Vulnerable, it's Jane Connery, and co-founder of the Together Declaration campaign, it's Alan Miller, and of course, assistant editor of Conservative Home, it's William Atkinson. All of you, thank you very, very much. It's ladies first on this show, and I'm not shy about that. Jane, go on, take it away. Do you think that Matt Hancock should face criminal charges?
I think we've got to look at the evidence so far, and it's very clear what happened during the pandemic. Mm-hmm. The care sector was secondary to the NHS. Elderly were thrown under the bus. Carers were thrown under the bus. And we saw the fallout, over that period of time where elderly were left without family members going in. And we have to remember that it wasn't just COVID that sadly killed elderly in care homes. It was neglect as well, because loved ones, particularly with those living with dementia, could not go in. And we supported so many families, hundreds of families. And, we can sit here and now look at the WhatsApp messages and we can say, well, if there is evidence there that shows that Matt Hancock did indeed, do what he's been accused of, allegedly, then he has to be held accountable. But I will add, not just Matt Hancock, Boris Johnson needs to be held accountable too.
OK, all right. And I think as well it's important just to emphasise, reading between the lines of what you were saying there, by what he's been accused of, I think the allegation really today is that instead of allowing people into care homes and testing absolutely everybody that could go in and out of care homes, he maybe siphoned off some of those tests to the wider community, and as a result, possibly vulnerable people died. So that's kind of where we are there. So that, I suppose, is why you're saying he potentially could face criminal charges. I'm going to go over now to the co-founder of the Together Declaration campaign. It's Alan Miller. Now Alan, your view on this, is it that he should maybe face criminal charges for a slightly different aspect of the COVID lockdowns and his role in that, not necessarily just care homes?
I think there's a number of things here, and we have to break them down. Firstly, in April 2020, 3 months into lockdown, people were still being released directly, even that had tested positive, into care homes directly. So on the one hand, it was preposterous that there's this attempt to do so many more tests when actually directly they're being put into the most vulnerable. All of the conversations about the protection, the ring, were completely then dubious. They're flawed. And then there's a continuation of that to try and present some kind of big drive to have 100,000, and then that led on to the whole discussion about vaccinations. But the most vulnerable that we knew from very early on at the get-go were put at direct risk. That is absolutely disgraceful and shameful, 45,000 or more. Then in addition to that, we should note that there was also a push to have a mandatory vaccination for all the care workers, and we lost 40,000, in excess of 40,000 care workers who'd already been bravely working on the line there. So the whole treatment of the care sector was outrageous. Now, the question is, though, as well, if we take a step back, there was deceit and there were lies, it looks like, But it's also the case that I think that the Great Barrington Declaration had it right in terms of shielding, that actually the care workers should have stayed in at the homes. But there's a question about also the fatality rate. We have to remind ourselves, and the eldest and most vulnerable, and how they would have got it. So there's the question of his role. There's also the question of who we would have expected. It sounds terrible to say, but who we would have expected to die. We should not have locked down the whole of society on the basis of doing this, and we should have actually protected and shielded the most vulnerable.
Okay. I'll come back to you. You've hit quite a lot of bases there. I think it remains to be seen exactly which elements of those would be criminal, but essentially we can extrapolate on that a little bit later on. But I am going to go... Matt Hancock spoke of muddying the waters and not wanting to. Well, let's potentially pop a little bit of chlorine into this swimming pool. The assistant editor of Conservative Home, William Atkinson. Now, I understand you've got quite a different view about all of this when it comes to whether or not Matt Hancock could actually face charges for anything.
Yes, I think on a fundamental basis, though of course they relate, any decision related to the handling of the pandemic potentially have led to the loss of lives that shouldn't otherwise have been lost. Ultimately, I don't think Matt Hancock should be prosecuted for something that was a political decision, especially as these files purportedly show, that this was a failure that extended much further beyond Matt Hancock himself. This was clearly a British state and a British government system that had no idea what it was doing. This is evidence that the loss of life during COVID and the excess loss of life was the product of government cock-up rather than conspiracy.
But William,
I'm going to stick with you, William. Sorry.
William, I'm going to stick with you, but just ask you to qualify that, because I thought, William, we were following the science. But hang on a minute, now it's a political cock-up.
Well, I think as Neil Ferguson, the good Neil Ferguson, not the other Neil Ferguson, says in his book Doom, which is on similar tragedies to this, it's a combination of a natural disaster and with poor political decision-making, which turns these natural events into events where there is a catastrophic loss of life. And I think that's a similar case here, though I would qualify the use of the word catastrophic. I think it's clear that from what we've seen that the British state had no idea what it was fundamentally dealing with. This is a pandemic that was not aligned with the pandemic planning that we already had. And what you saw in the first few months of the pandemic, especially with government ministers and governing institutions, whether that was scientists or whether that was people working in the NHS, struggling to cope with something they didn't understand. So I don't think Matt Hancock
William, I get
alone.
That. I get that. I'm going to interrupt. I want to bring the others in. Look, Jane, back to you. Go on.
No, I don't accept that. I don't think the care sector will accept that. Matt Hancock came out and absolutely said that the guidance was that, families couldn't go into care homes, that there's huge consequence to that. We can't now retract and say, well, the government, it was a cock-up. You can't do that.
But it's not criminal, though, Jane, is it?
Over 43,000 lives were lost. And, the care sector was all but failed during the pandemic. I don't accept that at all. And I certainly know that the care sector won't accept that, nor the families of those that died. I think that's an absolute insult.
OK, now, Alan, this is a key point. As we've rightly heard, there are around 43,200 odd people died in care homes. That's in England alone, by the way. And really the question is, Matt Hancock will vehemently deny this, and I think he's well within his rights to, by the way. But the question really is, Alan, should people hold him personally responsible for that? Because if they do, then I suppose it would verge onto the elements of the criminal, wouldn't it?
Well, I think what we have to do is, this is a political question, and I think that there was disingenuous, there was nudge, there were lies, there was... it's become clear that in the exchanges there was all sorts of attempts to actually muddy the waters, what he was saying he didn't want to do, to actually obfuscate, to do things that were downright disingenuous and dishonest. Now, the question is, the question of the legal question is another one. I think what's important is that as we're reeling from the consequences of Matt Hancock and Boris Johnson and others, of the lockdowns, of the impositions, of the impacts to the care homes and families and people who couldn't see their nearest and dearest, the ongoing measures that were imposed on there, as we're reeling from that, we are able to say never again. Why did the pandemic strategy, the preparedness strategy, get jettisoned? That we don't allow the Public Order Act or that to happen again with lockdowns, and that we actually insist that we have a proper pandemic preparedness strategy, not one that the WHO or anyone else puts forward, but that we have, that we say we learn from these. We don't wait 5 or 10 years for the COVID inquiry, and we insist never again, because many people still don't actually realise that the reason we're dealing with some of these cost of living problems and issues in our health sector is directly as a consequence of lockdowns, which we should never have had, as well as the treatment of care homes.
I actually think...
Guys, I'm sorry. Look, I'm really sorry. I'm really sorry about this. We have got to keep it moving, I'm afraid. Look, it's such an emotive issue. I really appreciate all of your time, and thank you very, very much. And I'm sorry to cut you all off, but you know how it is on this show, I'm afraid. It's bang, 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 isn't it? That was director and founder of Care Campaign for the Vulnerable. It's Jane Connery, co-founder of the Together Declaration campaign. It's Alan Miller, and assistant editor of Conservative Home, William Atkinson. So, who do you agree with? Should Hancock face a criminal investigation for the pandemic failings? And yes, I've got some of your wonderful tweets. Thank you very much, everyone. I know I'm not Dan Wootton, but I'm doing my best. David on Twitter says, yes, if evidence shows significant failings, and the same for any other potential breaches of law by ministers. Well, look, by definition, if it comes down to the realms of criminality, there would have to be breaches of law. I think this is the thing, isn't it? Being a bit squiffy with the truth, or being morally bankrupt, of course, two things that Matt Hancock would deny anyway, they're not criminal. They're not. So it would have to be literally a break of the law, and that, I suppose, is really what we're questioning here. Kath on Twitter says, why? Nobody in the history of this country has had to deal with a pandemic. It's not quite true, but I will take your point. There were no rules or guidelines to go by. Now, that's fascinating, isn't it? Because, yes, I get that. And I want to say to everyone who's watching this right now who will be saying, look, come on, we didn't know it was chaos, mistakes were made. Yeah, fine, all right. But what about if the fact that we were being told things that were known not to be true? This ring of steel around care homes, and that means that people couldn't see their loved ones in their final moments, when the person telling you that you couldn't see your loved one in their final moments knew that there were people wandering in and out of care homes who hadn't been tested. That, I think, is a key point. One more. Clive on Twitter says, must face life imprisonment. Let's tell you what, next time, Clive, yeah? Tweet in, tell us what you really think. Must face life imprisonment. He's either the stupidest person in the UK or extremely evil. He's responsible for thousands of deaths, in my opinion. OK, strong stuff. Again, Matt Hancock would obviously refute all of that. And your verdict is in now, OK? 69% of you agree that Matt Hancock should face a criminal investigation. I hope he's not watching. I hope he is, maybe, in a way. Well, 31% of you say they should not.